Bring you highlights from the past month from Depka Files' exclusive news, insight, and analysis in the Middle East. Let's take a look at the headlines. Iran's guards build up naval forces in Hormuz. Assad connives in an ISIS massacre of Syrian Druzes. Putin moves away from U.S. and Israel and woos France and Germany. Iran chooses Iraq to help fight U.S. sanctions. The U.S. begins the first steps to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. Crimea versus Syria and Iran at the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki. Two Gulf princes have taken issue with Trump's engagement with Iran. Israel names new military chief for Project Iran with U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Impending war between Israel and Iran. Prior to the new U.S. sanctions that are going into effect, Iran's Revolutionary Guards Navy is building forces at the Hormuz Strait. They're positioning warships outside the opening of the waterway, ready to block the passage for Gulf oil exports. Last Thursday, the U.S. Central Command issued a statement that said, quote, "We're aware of the increase in Iran naval operations within the Arabian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and Gulf of Oman. We are monitoring it closely and will continue to work with our partners to ensure freedom of navigation and free flow of commerce in international waterways. We will also continue to advocate for all maritime forces to conform to international maritime customs, standards, and laws." Last Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that any Iranian attempt to block the Bab al-Mandeb Straits would be met with force by the Israeli military. Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman had this to say at a Navy ceremony in Haifa on August 1st.
אם איראן תנסה לחסום את מיצרי באב אל-מנדב, אני משוכנע שהיא תמצא את עצמה מול קואליציה בינלאומית נחושה למנוע ממנה זאת, וקואליציה זאת תכלול גם את מדינת ישראל על כל זרועותיה.
לאחרונה שמענו איומים לפגוע בספינות ישראליות בים סוף. אני מסתכל על האנשים מסביבי הנמצאים כאן, וחבל שגם אויבינו לא יכולים לראות אתכם ולהבין שאנו ערוכים היטב לתת מענה לכל איום.
Syrian forces withdrew from the Diyatha base where they monitored ISIS activity before moving west. Syrian Druze authorities rejected an offer by the Syrian government to protect them against the Islamists and said they could manage alone. To teach the Druze residents a lesson for their independent spirit and pride, the Russians and Syrians pushed out the residents of Diyatha, allowing ISIS terrorists to invade the surrounding towns. When Druze fighters tried to save their communities, it was too late. ISIS slaughtered 256 people and injured almost 400 others. Many Druze Arabs showed up for the rally in the Golan Heights, in which they protested killings in Syria.
هذا العمل الإجرامي يتضامن معه أبناء جولان لأنهم كتلة واحدة من الشعب السوري وأخوة ويقفون مع أهلهم في القطر سوريا.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has moved away from the understandings with the U.S. and Israel on Syria, which were sealed at his Helsinki summit with President Donald Trump. This policy reversal came after Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov could not accomplish their goal of convincing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to accept a Russian compromise to move Iran 100 kilometers from the Israeli border. A Russian deal with Netanyahu was one of Trump's conditions for collaborating with Moscow to resolve the crisis in Syria. When Netanyahu dug in on the Iranian issue, Putin put Helsinki behind him and ordered Lavrov and Gerasimov to go to Paris and Berlin with several objectives. First, they would attempt to persuade France and Germany to drop out of the U.S.-led Geneva Conference on Syria and join the Russian Astana peace process at its next session in Sochi on July 30th and 31st. This would also open the door to their understandings with Iran and Turkey on other key issues in addition to Syria. Russian President Putin and Turkish President Erdogan spoke at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Наши отношения двухсторонние находятся на подъеме, совершенно очевидно. И в области преодоления кризисов, прежде всего, конечно, я имею в виду сирийский кризис.
Öyle zannediyorum ki bu yıl hakikaten bir 6 milyon gibi bir turist noktasında Türkiye'yi ziyaret edecek. Tüm bunlarla beraber aramızdaki her türlü dayanışma birilerini de gerçekten kıskandırıyor.
President Putin also says he wants France and Germany to withdraw their forces from the U.S.-led coalition in Syria. In a direct anti-Israel turnaround, Putin sees Russia, France, and Germany teaming up to demand Israel's adherence to UN Security Council Resolution 232 to withdraw from territory captured in 1967, according to the pro-Palestinian interpretation that was based on a resolution made in 1973 for a ceasefire. Putin is awaiting a response from German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron. Meanwhile, Moscow has rejected all of Netanyahu's proposals to remove Iran and Hezbollah from Syria. After Iranian President Hassan Rouhani threatened the U.S. with war, President Trump responded with the following tweet. Quote, "Never ever threaten the United States or you will suffer consequences, the likes of which few have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious." Although the White House Security Council and State Department believe that the Iranian government will collapse under a sinking economy and domestic unrest, Depka analysts see Iran hitting back at Washington in Iraq. The unrest Tehran incited last week in Shiite-dominated southern Iraq thwarted U.S. efforts to help a government coalition without Iranian influence rising in Iraq, 3 months after the general elections. The U.S. plan to send armed Kurdish forces into Iran backfired as Iran and Turkey formed a joint command center to launch attacks on Kurdish targets in Iraq. For every new sanction that the U.S. puts on Iran, Tehran plans to subvert U.S. interests in other parts of the Middle East. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that U.S. broadcasting in Farsi would be increased, which would offer a way to urge the Iranian people to rise up against the tyranny in Tehran. Israel's former UN ambassador, Dor Gold, spoke to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee's Oversight and Governance Reform Subcommittee to discuss the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Depka sources reveal that this was the first step of Netanyahu and Trump to recognize Israel's annexation for the Golan, which Israel captured from Syria in the Six-Day War. Dor Gold stated that the U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty would fulfill previous administration's promises. He also argued that Netanyahu would work with Syrian President Bashar Assad to discuss surrendering parts of the Golan to Syria. He said the Golan, while only 16 miles across, is of utmost importance to Israel, as the IDF post on the top of Mount Hermon provides a strategic military advantage to view key areas in Syria. This is especially important now that Russia could save the Assad regime and the Syrian military could be strengthened. Iran has positioned Shiite militias with forces from Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Pakistan on Syrian bases to take control of southern Syria. A Syrian presence on the Golan raises concerns for Israel. The loss of intelligence outposts would prevent Israel from being able to detect a Syrian offensive, and Israel would be hesitant to wage war to recover its former line of defense after it was enclosed in Syrian territory. Any security arrangement on Syrian land could deprive Israel of the Golan and security. Iran's axis of resistance, which has been operating under Russian protection, threatens several Middle Eastern countries, including the Arab Gulf states and Morocco. These governments would not question the need for a permanent Israeli presence on the Golan. The Assad regime is recovering from a civil war, and its allies are making demands, which include returning the Golan Heights. U.S. recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan would prevent that threat of Iran and its supporters. We're waiting to hear from Helsinki about the first face-to-face meeting between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. They've scheduled a joint press conference, although no agenda has been set. There's been much speculation about what could occur. At a news conference after the NATO summit, Trump said he had played no role in the annexation process as it occurred during the Obama administration. Trump spoke about the upcoming Helsinki summit.
I think it's a good thing to meet. I do believe in meetings. I believe that having a meeting with Chairman Kim was a good thing. I think having meetings with the president of China was a very good thing. I believe it's really good. So having meetings with Russia, China, North Korea, I believe in it. Nothing bad's going to come out of it, and maybe some good will come out.
Netanyahu had this to say about the summit in Helsinki.
אתמול שוחחתי עם נשיא ארצות הברית דונלד טראמפ, דנו בסוגיות ביטחוניות ומדיניות לאור ההתפתחויות באזור, כמובן בראש ובראשונה על סוריה ואיראן. כפי שאתם יודעים, הנושאים האלה יעלו גם בפסגת הנשיאים בהלסינקי, אני כמובן שוחחתי עליהם ביום רביעי גם עם הנשיא פוטין. אני הודיתי לנשיא טראמפ על המדיניות התקיפה שלו נגד איראן, כי מאז נקיטת המדיניות הזאת אנחנו רואים את ההשפעה הגדולה על איראן ובתוך איראן. הנשיא טראמפ חזר בבהירות חדה על המחויבות שלו לביטחון ישראל ועל נכונותו לעזור למדינת ישראל בתחומים שונים, ואני כמובן הודיתי לו על כך.
Crimea citizens hope to have Russian citizenship recognized as a result of the Trump-Putin summit.
Отношения должны быть нормальными между любыми другими государствами, тем более с Соединенными Штатами Америки. Я на личном примере моего сына, нашей семьи и так далее. Я глубоко в этом заинтересован, чтобы были нормальные отношения. Он мог легко приезжать, без проблем. Мы могли ездить. Он без конца приглашает нас. Но я понимаю, конечно, у нас проблемы с визами возникают и так далее. Пока нет. Пока нет. Он приглашает, да, зовет нас и так далее. Он будет там работать, способствовать, чтобы мы как можно быстрее получили визу. Ну, еще не пытались, честно говоря. Но задача так и стоит. Может быть, даже в будущем году, в этом, наверное, не получится, в будущем году уже этот вопрос возникнет явно, потому что он приезжать так часто уже не сможет.
In Kiev, a Ukrainian official compared Trump's acceptance of Crimea's annexation to the 1939 pact between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Trump then stated that Germany's government was captive to Russia due to the natural gas pipeline that runs between Berlin and Moscow. Trump's strategy for Crimea would include removing its annexation from the agenda as long as Putin would replace China's Xi Jinping as mediator between Trump and Kim Jong-un. This new strategy came about on Thursday when the Russian embassy in Pyongyang announced that Ri Ryong-nam, North Korea's president of the Korean Football Association, was invited to the 2018 World Cup in Moscow on July 15th. Putin would be able to get the consent of Kim Jong-un prior to the Trump-Putin summit. Meanwhile, Trump's reported plan for his meeting with Syria was to offer a U.S. pullback from eastern Syria and the border with Iraq, which would begin after the evacuation of Iranian, Hezbollah, and Shiite forces. The U.S. in turn would need to evacuate from the Al-Tanf outpost, which is on the intersection of Syrian, Iraqi, and Jordanian borders. The aides preparing Trump's summit with Putin advised him to limit his offer to Al-Tanf, but they realize that the president may expand this offer during negotiations. Officials in Washington and Jerusalem hope that Putin sees the benefit in the proposals and Assad could take over Syria's frontier lands without violence during Russian-brokered ceasefire deals with the rebels. Iran's rulers are fixed in their determination to remain in Syria. Trump's sanctions on the Iranian economy and oil sales over the next few months could influence them. Depka intelligence sources report that Netanyahu presented Putin with a list of the units that Hezbollah and Shiite militias are fielding for the Syrian army's Dara and Quneitra operations near the Jordanian-Israeli border. They make up 18,000 combatants under the orders of Iran's southeastern Syrian command from its base at Izra. Half of the forces in the southeastern Syria area are made up of Shiite troops under Iranian command, which are in violation of Putin's promise to Israel and the U.S. to keep the troops out of Syria's southern region. Putin's promise was also broken when the Russian Air Force conducted dozens of airstrikes to support his southern Syrian offensive. The United Arab Emirates Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Gargash, stated last Thursday that the UAE is ready to deploy more troops across the Middle East and cannot rely on Western allies to oversee the region. His speech reflected the views of Abu Dhabi and Riyadh after a sense of betrayal when President Donald Trump offered to renegotiate the nuclear deal with Tehran. His statements indicate that the Gulf Emirates are rejecting a plan that the Trump administration is setting forth. Washington has proposed establishing a new security and political alliance with 6 Gulf Arab nations to counter Iranian expansion. The White House is looking to get cooperation on missile defense, military training, and counterterrorism while strengthening economic and diplomatic ties. Depka sources report that the countries are now realizing they must fend for themselves and no longer trust the Trump administration to protect them against Iran. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi do not think that talk of an Arab NATO against Iran will work in their favor. The Saudis suspect that the U.S. is tailoring the intelligence provided to corner the 2 Gulf leaders into negotiating peace with the Houthi enemies. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed are also dissatisfied with Trump's pick for Oman to be the liaison with Tehran, as they do not view the leader as an ally. Sultan Qaboos bin Zayed of Oman is aligned with Iranian positions and an ally of Qatar. The princes are concerned that negotiations between the U.S. and Iran through Sultan's office could cut them out of the picture. The princes are also concerned that Trump will allow Syria to fall into the hands of Iran and Russia by pulling U.S. troops out of the country. Tehran would then have possession of the land bridge from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Saudis released a statement last Monday that said, quote, Riyadh has reassured Arab allies that it will not endorse any Middle East peace plan that fails to address Jerusalem's status or the refugees' right of return. If Trump does not follow through with its pledges to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia does not see why it should underwrite Trump's Middle East peace plan.
Depka file reports that Israel's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot, has appointed the head of IDF Operations Branch, Major General Nitzan Alon, as the director of Project Iran. Eisenkot decided on this appointment after meeting last week with U.S. Chairman of the U.S. Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and head of CENTCOM, General Joseph Votel, in Washington. Depka military sources report that Eisenkot became concerned when he realized the U.S. and Russia were at odds over Iranian and Hezbollah forces being allowed to join the Syrian army's drive to Syrian-Israeli and Syrian-Jordanian borders. On Wednesday, after Eisenkot visited the Golan to inspect the IDF preparations, Russian and Syrian airstrikes resumed against rebels in Dara. The ceasefire negotiations did not last when Russia insisted that Iran and Hezbollah were to remain in Syria. Tensions also rose on the broader Iranian front, facing the U.S. and its Middle East allies, when General Qasem Soleimani told Iranian President Rouhani that he was ready to put into action Rouhani's threat to halt Gulf oil exports after the U.S. ban on Iranian oil goes into effect on November 4th. Israel and the U.S. have set up 4 command groups to carry out their Iran strategy in partnership with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The first is the Nuclear Command Group for dealing with nuclear targets in Iran, including weaponry, plutonium reactors, uranium enrichment plants, and centrifuge production sites. The Ballistic Command Group will deal with Iran's ballistic missile stocks and launch sites, as well as missile production plans and institutes for missile research and development. The Anti-Subversion Command Group will run covert operations against Iranian military and intelligence centers in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Economic Command Group will deal with U.S. sanctions against Iran and cyber warfare. Major General Nitzan Alon will oversee all 4 groups. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Russian President Putin met in Moscow on July 11th and agreed on the stipulation that Israel would accept Syrian military forces on its Golan border if Bashar Assad would respect the 1974 ceasefire lines and accept a UN observer to monitor the demilitarized zone. This would be a deal that Putin and the U.S. president would agree upon at their summit in Helsinki on Monday. The agreement would be dependent on Iran withdrawing from Syria, which is highly unlikely to happen. The demilitarized zone runs from the Golan to Mount Hermon. If Russia and Syria agree to the Israeli proposal, Israel would need to accept Syrian tanks and artillery on Israel's Golan and the Sea of Galilee. In exchange, Russia and Syria would guarantee the withdrawal from Syria of all pro-Iranian forces, including Hezbollah and the Iraqi, Afghan, and Pakistani Shiite militias under the Revolutionary Guard's command. Yet the agreement talks between Putin and Netanyahu failed.
Помним, Мы прошли по Красной площади с портретом одного из героев Второй мировой войны. И, уверяю вас, это нашло очень позитивный отклик, было замечено российской общественностью.
אני חייב להגיד לך שלפני כמה שעות כלי טיס סורי חדר, שחדר לשטח ישראל, אנחנו הרדנו אותו ואנחנו נמשיך לפעול בתקיפות נגד כל זליגה, כל חדירה לשטחה האווירי או הקרקעי של ישראל. אנחנו מצפים שכולם יכבדו את הריבונות הזאת ושסוריה תשמור בקפדנות על הסכמי ההפרדה.
Meanwhile, Syrian government forces and their Hezbollah and pro-Iranian Shiite allies launched a battle to capture Tal Hara, which would be the key to controlling the Quneitra region opposite Israel's Golan border. The operation is accompanied by negotiations with the rebel defenders to lay down arms and surrender. Israeli forces on the Golan have been reinforced and are prepared to take on the threat. Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman had this to say.
לא השתנתה, אנחנו לא נאפשר התבססות איראן בסוריה ולא נאפשר להפוך את אדמת סוריה למוצב קדמי כנגד מדינת ישראל. שום דבר לא השתנה, אין שום דבר חדש. גם לגבי הלחימה בדרום סוריה, אנחנו מבחינתנו נקדש את הסכם ההפרדה מ-74 וגם שם נקפיד על קוצו של יוד וכל הפרה תענה בתגובה חריפה של מדינת ישראל.